The year was 1945, the final spring of World War II, a season stained with exhaustion, uncertainty, and the weight of a collapsing Reich. In a remote clearing on the outskirts of a recently liberated European village, a group of German women, young, old, frightened, and utterly drained, stood huddled beneath the grey morning sky. They were prisoners of war now, stripped not only of rank and purpose, but of any illusion that the world they once knew still existed. The air was cold enough to burn lungs, yet thick with the lingering smoke of a battlefield that had fallen silent only hours earlier. American soldiers, weary from nights without sleep, patrolled the edges of the makeshift camp. Their boots sank into the wet soil as they moved, measured steps, heavy breaths, rifles slung low but ready. A distant echo of artillery hung in the air like a fading memory, but here, in this temporary pocket of quiet, only the rustle of canvas tents and the trembling breaths of captured women filled the space. No one knew what would happen next. The German women exchanged nervous glances, their cheeks streaked with dirt, their uniforms worn thin, their hands shaking from hunger and fear. They had heard rumors, some comforting, others terrifying, but none of them expected what came next. Suddenly, an American sergeant stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding as it cut through the cold morning air. "Form a line, now." The women froze. Their hearts pounded. Their minds raced. Not a single one understood the reason behind the sudden order, only that the tone carried urgency, not brutality, and yet it was enough to jolt them into motion. The moment the American sergeant's voice shattered the cold morning air, a ripple of confusion moved through the group of German POW women like a sudden gust of wind brushing across a still lake. Some reacted immediately, as if their bodies remembered the structure and submission of military discipline even when their minds hesitated. Their boots shifted in the mud, their shoulders stiffened, and their tired eyes flicked toward the direction of the voice. Others stood frozen in place, unsure if they should obey instantly or wait for further explanation. Nothing about captivity felt predictable, and the line between command and threat had grown dangerously thin over the past weeks. But the tone, sharp, commanding, yet strangely controlled, left little room for hesitation. A few women exchanged glances, silent questions passing between them. What does he want? Are we being moved? Are we being separated? The uncertainty stabbed deeper than any physical discomfort. They had already endured marches across fields, littered with burnt vehicles, nights spent shivering in makeshift barns, and interrogations that felt more like disorienting conversations than the violent interrogations they had feared. But this sudden order, it carried weight. It demanded action. And so, one by one, they began to step forward. Mud clung to their boots with a sticky grip, pulling at them with every step. The ground was soft, churned from days of troop movement, rainfall, and the chaotic arrival of prisoners who had stumbled into this temporary camp just hours earlier. The damp earth released a sour smell, half wet soil, half decaying leaves, that mixed with the faint metallic scent of spent ammunition scattered somewhere beyond the tree line. Every inhale carried the sharp reminder of war's aftertaste. A few of the women wrinkled their noses. Others simply accepted it as another discomfort in a life now built entirely of discomfort. Their uniforms, faded, grimy, and tattered from weeks of retreat, scratched their skin with every movement. Some wore jackets missing buttons, others had sleeves torn from snags on barbed wire while fleeing, and all carried the stains of smoke, sweat, and survival. The once Pristine tailoring of German military attire had dissolved into shapeless fabric that barely clung to their frames. Threads dangled from hems, patches clung desperately to elbows and knees, and several women had wrapped old scarves or strips of cloth around their waists to keep their trousers from slipping. Hunger had carved their bodies thin, exhaustion had carved their expressions hollow. As they formed the line, the soundscape of the camp shifted. The shuffle of boots dragging through mud, the faint clinking of canteens bouncing against metal belt clasps, the creaking tension of leather straps worn thin, the cold wind slicing across fabric, even the muffled breaths, some shallow, some trembling, added to the atmosphere. Many of the women inhaled through their noses slowly, exhaling through parted lips as they struggled to calm nerves stretched thin by fear and uncertainty. The American sergeant who issued the order stood a few meters away, his posture rigid but not aggressive. His eyes scanned the forming line with a practiced efficiency, counting, observing, assessing. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. His face drawn, his stubble coarse along his jawline, shadows under his eyes deep enough to signal months of strain. His uniform, though cleaner than the women's, bore the unmistakable signs of fatigue: creased fabric, dust smeared across his sleeves, a collar slightly loosened, as if he had given up the idea of looking presentable. Yet there was a calm firmness in his stance, the kind that suggested this was neither the first nor the 20th group of POWs he had handled. Behind him, two younger American soldiers lingered, the rifles slung casually over their shoulders, not pointed, not threatening, but visibly present. They, too, wore the same exhausted expressions that had become universal among Allied troops during these final months of the war. Their boots were splattered with mud, and their helmets rested slightly askew on their heads. One soldier rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, fighting off the weight of sleepless nights. The other shifted his stance repeatedly, perhaps to generate warmth, perhaps out of nervous habit. As the German women settled into a line stretching nearly 40 meters, a thick silence enveloped the clearing. No one spoke, neither prisoner nor soldier. Even the distant rumble of military trucks seemed to quiet, as if the entire camp paused to acknowledge the tension building in this unremarkable, yet emotionally complex moment. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs straightening reflexively, their hands clasping the edges of their sleeves or the fabric around their waists. Some kept their gaze fixed on the ground, others stared forward, their eyes unfocused, their minds racing through possibilities. Many imagined the worst. They had heard stories, whispers passed through exhausted, frightened captives, that the Americans might separate them from the main group, or interrogate them again, or force them into manual labor right away. Others feared immediate transport to an unknown location, unsure if the next camp would be safer or harsher. A few carried a different worry. What if they were being lined up for identification by civilians from nearby towns? Civilians who despised everything the German uniform represented. The thought made their hands tremble. And yet, beneath these fears, there was another, quieter emotion: relief. However fragile, however faint, it existed. The sharpness of the sergeant's voice might have startled them, but it lacked the cruelty they had come to dread in the war's final chaos. There was structure here, procedure, a sense of order that, paradoxically, brought an unexpected comfort. Even in captivity, the clarity of a command, form a line, felt more predictable than the blind uncertainty that had guided them for weeks. Some women took deep breaths, steadying their nerves, Others wiped dirt from their cheeks using shaky fingers. A few closed their eyes momentarily, exhausted minds begging for a moment of stillness. The line slowly tightened as women shuffled closer, seeking balance on the uneven ground. The cold wind tugged at loose strands of hair, rustled the edges of jackets, and stung exposed skin. Several women pulled their collars closer to their necks, trying to trap even a whisper of warmth. The American sergeant finally stepped forward again, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. He paced in front of the line, scanning each face one by one. His eyes lingered just long enough to confirm presence, to register exhaustion, to observe injuries. This was not the gaze of a man searching for threats. It was the gaze of someone ensuring control over a situation that needed to remain orderly. After months of combat, chaos was his enemy as much as the German army had been. The women stood motionless as he passed, their breathing synchronized into a subtle rhythm of fear and waiting. No one dared to move, not even to shift their weight. They waited for the next command, the next step in a process they did not understand. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the sergeant stopped at the center of the line, planted his boots firmly, and crossed his arms. He looked over the clearing, then back at the women, assessing the formation. The two younger soldiers stepped up beside him, their clipboards ready, their expressions serious. The tension in the air tightened, the same way the air changes just before a storm breaks. For the German women, that moment, the silence, the waiting, the unreadable faces of the soldiers, felt like standing on a narrow cliff edge, unable to see what lay below. But one thing was clear: this single, sudden command had changed the atmosphere entirely. The line was formed. The mood was set. Something significant was about to begin. As the line finally steadied, and the initial tremor of confusion began to settle, the atmosphere in the camp shifted into something far more complex. An uneasy mixture of anticipation, fear, and unexpected calm. The American soldiers, who only moments ago had adopted rigid postures and sharp tones, now moved with a more deliberate, measured pace. Their boots pressed into the mud with a slow, steady rhythm, as if even the ground itself demanded caution. Each step they took carried the fatigue of months spent marching across battle-worn landscapes, liberating one ruined town after another, constantly unsure whether the next corner hid an ambush or a surrender. One soldier, younger than the rest, approached the front of the line with a clipboard tucked under his arm. His gloves were stiff with cold, and after tugging one off with his teeth, he rubbed his palm against his trousers, trying to regain feeling. His breath escaped in small white clouds, blending with the thin fog that hovered just above the ground. The women watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. He wasn't threatening. Not in stance, not in expression, but uncertainty itself carried its own weight, heavy enough to still the breath in their chests. Behind him, a second American soldier carried a small crate filled with ration tins. The cans clinked softly against one another, a delicate metallic music that felt almost out of place in a setting built on silence and tension. The women's eyes followed the movement of the crate. Hunger pressed down on them like an invisible hand squeezing their ribs inward. They hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, sometimes even longer. For some, the last real meal had been during their chaotic retreat weeks earlier, long before their capture. A third soldier, older than the others, his face lined with exhaustion and responsibility, stepped forward holding a small medical pouch. It swung lightly at his side with each step, brushing against his hip in a subtle rhythm. He cleared his throat before speaking, choosing his words carefully, his tone deliberate. He addressed the women slowly, making sure the language barrier didn't fracture the message he needed them to understand. The words were simple. They were going to be counted-checked, given food and water, evaluated for injuries before relocation. This wasn't a punishment. It was procedure. The reaction was immediate, though not vocal. A ripple of disbelief moved quietly along the line. Women shifted their weight slightly, their stiff postures loosening by fractions. Shoulders lowered a centimeter. Tension slipped, only slightly, from trembling hands. Their minds struggled to process what they were hearing. For weeks they had prepared themselves for cruelty, for humiliation, for vengeance from the people they once considered enemies. And yet now, the men before them seemed strangely calm, composed, and almost, though no one dared to think the word, merciful. The first woman in line was a tall, gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. Her hair hung in tangled strands across her face, and her lips were so dry they had cracked at the corners. When the American medic approached her, she instinctively took half a step back, her boots sliding in the mud. The soldier paused, not aggressively, but with a patience that seemed to catch her off guard. He held out his empty hand, palm upward, as if to show he carried nothing that could harm her. Slowly, haltingly, she stepped forward again. He reached gently for her wrist, lifting her arm just enough to check her pulse. Her hands shook violently. Not because he was hurting her, but because the simple act of being touched without hostility felt almost surreal. He examined her fingers, inspecting the darkening bruises around her nails, signs of frostbite or perhaps an infection from days of marching in the cold. He nodded, not to her, but to himself, then reached into his pouch and pulled out a small piece of bread. At first, she didn't understand what he was doing. Her eyes darted between the bread and the soldier's expression, searching for hidden intent. When he extended the bread toward her, her breath caught in her throat. Hesitation formed a visible tension in her shoulders, pulling them upward toward her neck. She stared at the food for a long moment, as if she were trying to confirm that it was real. Then, slowly, with trembling fingers, she took it from his hand. Her fingers wrapped around the bread so tightly. It seemed she feared it might disappear. If she didn't hold on with all her remaining strength, her lips parted, but no sound emerged. The soldier simply nodded and motioned for her to step aside after she was checked. She obeyed, but she did not eat the bread. Not yet. She held it carefully, almost reverently, as if it were a fragile artifact rather than a small piece of rations. Behind her, the line shifted subtly. The women were no longer just standing still, they were watching. Their eyes followed every movement the Americans made, every gesture, every sound. They watched how the medic handled the first woman with care, how the ration distributor never raised his voice, how the soldier with the clipboard wrote calmly, methodically, without displaying frustration or impatience. The women's breathing grew lighter, though fear still lingered sharply beneath the surface. The second woman in line swallowed hard as the soldier approached her. She looked younger than the others, barely out of her teens, her face streaked with soot and dried tears. She tried to stand straight, tried to appear composed, but her thin frame trembled visibly. When the medic examined her hands, she winced, not from pain but from nerves. When he handed her a canteen with a few sips of water, she held it tightly and whispered a faint, almost inaudible, "Dank." The soldier nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that required no shared language to understand. As more women stepped forward, a soft, rhythmic pattern began to take shape in the camp. The quiet scrape of boots moving through mud, the subtle thud of ration tins placed gently into waiting hands, the clipped sounds of pens marking names and details on the clipboard, the murmured exchanges between soldiers who coordinated the process with surprising efficiency. Each woman who received food or water reacted differently. Some accepted it with silent gratitude. Others cried softly, tears streaking through dirt on their cheeks. A few hesitated so long that the soldiers had to encourage them gently, reminding them that this was not a trick, not a demand of labor, not a punishment, just survival, just basic humanity. But the disbelief did not fade easily. After months of propaganda, months of fear, months of hearing stories of Allied brutality, the idea that their captors were treating them with measured restraint felt almost impossible to accept. That disbelief clung to them like frost clinging to grass on a winter morning. Yet hunger forced them past suspicion. Thirst pushed them to accept the water. Fatigue drove them to comply. Toward the middle of the line, two elderly women stood next to each other. Their backs were bent, their movements slow. The older of the two could barely lift her arms without wincing. When her turn came, the medic examined her hands, frowning at the swollen joints, the deep cuts, the frostbitten fingertips. He called for another soldier, who returned with a small cloth bandage and wrapped her hand gently. The elderly woman's eyes widened, confusion flickering across her worn features. It had been a long time since anyone touched her with care, let alone treated her wounds. The women behind her watched in stunned silence. Some had believed the Americans would treat them harshly, perhaps even violently. Instead, what they saw unfolding was something far more complicated, something human. The American soldiers were not smiling. They were not offering comfort with softness or warmth in their voices. They were tired, serious, professional. But they were not cruel, and in those final days of a brutal war, that alone felt like an unexpected mercy. The sound of ration tins continued. A faint metallic knocking that echoed through the clearing each time a can shifted in the crate. The women's stomachs tightened painfully at the sound, a reminder of how desperately they needed food. Each time a can was placed into a waiting pair of hands, the tension eased slightly, like a rope loosening around a chest. Still, no one spoke above a whisper. The camp felt suspended between fear and fragile hope, teetering on the thin line that separates enemy from survivor. By the time half the line had moved through the inspection process, a strange quiet had wrapped itself around the clearing. Even the distant engines seemed to hum more softly, the wind itself gentler. The women were beginning to understand, slowly, hesitantly, that they were not facing cruelty today. They were facing order, procedure, the kind of structure that signaled the end of chaos. The ration distributor called out for more supplies, and another soldier jogged toward the supply truck, his breath loud and uneven. The women watched him go, then watched him return with another crate filled with small, dented tins of food. He set it down carefully on a wooden crate, wiped his forehead, and resumed the task of handing out survival in metal form. At the far end of the line, a woman fainted from exhaustion. Two American soldiers rushed toward her, not with weapons raised, but with arms extended to catch her before she hit the ground. They carried her to a nearby bench, propped her up gently, and signaled for the medic. The women in line stared in silence, processing the scene with disbelief. The medic checked her pulse, tilted her head back slightly, and gave her water. A few German women, near the back of the line, pressed their hands to their mouths, shocked at the compassion unfolding before them. And then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere shifted again. The women began to stand straighter. Their shoulders loosened. Their breathing steadied. The fear, though not gone, no longer controlled their every movement. Uncertainty remained, but now it mingled with a cautious, trembling hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they were being treated as human beings rather than defeated enemies. One of the American soldiers glanced at the line, taking in the expressions on the women's faces. He didn't smile, but something in his posture softened. He saw not soldiers of the enemy, not symbols of the Reich, but a group of women broken by a war that had consumed the world. He saw survivors, and in the stillness of that moment, the war felt, if only for an instant, less brutal. As the inspection continued, the rhythm of the process, step forward, be checked, receive food, move aside, became its own strange heartbeat, pumping new life into a camp that had been frozen by fear only minutes earlier. Yet beneath that heartbeat, one truth lingered: these women had entered the line thinking the command would bring punishment. Instead, it brought the first flicker of humanity they had witnessed in weeks. And in that flicker, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. As the last few women reached the end of the line, a strange silence settled over the camp, one that felt heavier, denser, and more meaningful than any silence that had come before it. The process that had begun with tension and fear was now winding towards something none of the women had anticipated: a moment of uneasy clarity. The American soldiers, though exhausted, continued their work with a ritualistic precision that looked almost ceremonial under the pale light of the late afternoon. The sky had shifted from a dull morning grey to a deeper, colder blue, and the sun hovered low behind distant trees, spreading long shadows across the ground. Those shadows stretched over the faces of the German women, highlighting the exhaustion carved into their features. Their cheeks were hollow, their eyes reddened, their movements slow and stiff. Yet there was something new in their expressions, a cautious alertness, a fragile steadiness. They had endured the physical checks, the rationing, the silent evaluations. They had watched their fellow prisoners, treated with a degree of restraint that challenged everything they had expected from their captors. And now, as the line began to dissolve and each woman stepped into a small open area beside the camp fence, they understood that the next stage, the culmination of the moment begun earlier that morning, was about to unfold. The American sergeant, the same man whose sharp command had initiated everything, walked toward the gathering crowd of POW women. His steps were deliberate, as though he were carrying not just his own weight, but the weight of the situation itself. He stopped at the center of the clearing, exhaled deeply through his nose, and lifted a small notebook from his pocket. The worn cover, frayed at the corners, suggested he had carried it through long months of war, through rain, fire, marches, and sleepless nights. The pages inside contained lists, procedures, schedules, facts that needed to be recorded even when chaos surrounded him. The women watched him closely, their gazes following each subtle motion. Their breaths merged into a low, trembling rhythm that hung in the cold air like a fragile thread. Some clasped their ration tins against their chests, as though holding onto a lifeline. Others wrapped their arms around themselves, seeking warmth that simply wasn't there. The uncertainty of what was coming next pulled at their thoughts, tightening their chests, quickening their pulses. The sergeant raised his hand, not to shout a command, not to summon soldiers, but simply to gather attention. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone that was neither harsh nor gentle, but firm, structured, and undeniably clear. He informed them that the war was nearing its end, that the chaos beginning to rupture across Europe meant movements of prisoners had to be organized and controlled, that they would soon be transferred, not to punishment, not to an unknown fate, but to a larger, regulated POW camp where proper provisions, medical care, and documentation awaited them. The announcement struck the women like a physical blow, though not in the way a blow brings pain. It struck them with a force of disbelief so profound that several stared at one another, unsure if they had understood correctly. A regulated camp, medical care, provisions, these words felt unreal, almost dreamlike in contrast to the brutality they had witnessed on the front lines and during their retreat. Some women blinked rapidly, trying to steady their breath. Others lowered their heads as relief battled against lingering fear that this was too good to be true. But the sergeant's posture remained steady. His eyes did not waver. His words were not laced with threat or hidden meaning. They were straightforward, procedural, grounded in a bureaucratic necessity rather than emotional motive. And perhaps for that reason alone, the women began to believe him. One young woman near the front clutched her ration tin so tightly her knuckles turned white. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the tiniest fragment of relief to seep into the cracks of her fear. The idea of moving to a real camp, one with beds, food, structured routines, felt almost unbearable in its unexpected mercy. Another woman, older, with deep worry lines etched across her forehead, exhaled a shaky breath she no longer remembered holding. Her shoulders slumped slightly. She had not felt safe in months, not truly safe, and now the possibility of safety hovered just beyond her reach, close enough to imagine, but distant enough to fear losing. As the sergeant continued, he explained that transport trucks would arrive shortly. The women would be divided into small groups for efficient loading. The process needed to be orderly, calm. No one would be harmed. The soldiers were under strict instruction to maintain structure and avoid unnecessary aggression. His tone remained firm, controlled. He was a man who had delivered countless orders in the midst of chaos, a man who had learned that clarity was often the only barrier between stability and disaster. There was one more step, however. One final task before the transfer could begin. Every woman needed to be identified. The announcement caused a subtle shift in the group's energy. Identification meant standing before soldiers again, answering questions, allowing themselves to be inspected once more. A wave of nervousness passed through the crowd, tightening throats, speeding heartbeats. But it also carried a strange sense of legitimacy. Identification meant record, keeping, documentation. Elements of procedure that belonged to structured systems, not the unpredictable violence of the front. If the Americans were processing them as prisoners under regulation, not spontaneous action, then perhaps they were truly safe from retribution or mistreatment. The soldiers began arranging tables and wooden stools in a line along the clearing. Papers were spread out, pens uncapped, canteens placed nearby, as though the soldiers were preparing to conduct interviews rather than interrogations. The women watched the scene unfold with a bewildered mixture of suspicion and hope. No one shouted. No weapons were drawn. Everything was done with quiet efficiency, mechanical yet strangely gentle. The first group of women stepped forward. Their boots left deep impressions in the mud, each step deliberate, Cautious, they moved like people expecting the ground to shift beneath them at any moment. When they reached the tables, the American soldiers nodded and motioned for them to sit. The women hesitated. Some hovered above the stools, unsure whether they were truly free to sit. The soldiers nodded again, firm, encouraging, and slowly the women lowered themselves onto the seats. The identification process began. For each woman, the soldiers asked for her name, her unit, her age. Some women answered in German. Others struggled to recall their own words through the haze of exhaustion. The soldiers wrote everything down meticulously. When a woman's voice cracked or faltered, the soldier interviewing her simply waited, pen hovering, allowing her to gather herself. No one yelled at them to hurry. No one forced them to speak faster. It was a stillness none of the women had anticipated. As each identification ended, the women were escorted to a designated waiting area near the trucks. Some carried their food tins, others clutched blankets provided by the soldiers. A few women wept quietly, not from fear, but from emotional overflow from the strange, unbearable contrast between the horrors they had endured and the small mercies they were now witnessing. One German woman, tall with sharp features softened by fatigue, hesitated when her turn came. She approached the table slowly, her steps dragging. The soldier assigned to interview her looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. She had seen the eyes of soldiers before. Eyes filled with rage, with suspicion, with desperation, but his eyes were different. They showed only exhaustion, layered with a subtle sense of duty, not personal, not emotional, procedural. As she sat, her hands trembled so violently that the soldier paused before asking the first question. He reached behind him, picked up a canteen, and placed it gently in front of her. She stared at it, then at him. When she didn't move, he unscrewed the cap himself, pushed it slightly closer to her, and waited. Only when she lifted it and drank, her lips shaking against the cold metal rim, did he begin the interview. Around the clearing, similar scenes unfolded. Small acts of calm, small gestures of restraint, moments where fear collided with unexpected dignity, and slowly, very slowly, the tension began to melt from the air, replaced by a quiet hum of acceptance. The women realized the climax of their fear had already passed. The moment that had begun with a commanding shout, "Form a line now!" was now transforming into something altogether different. As the identification continued, trucks rumbled into the clearing, their engines sending vibrations through the ground. The women watched them approach, their expressions tightening once more with fear. But as the trucks halted and soldiers climbed down, not with aggression, but with clear instructions and prepared materials, the fear eased again. The trucks were not instruments of punishment, they were transportation. Their arrival signaled the final step before relocation. The sun dipped lower, casting long beams of golden light across the mud. Dust particles floated in the air, catching the light with a strange, almost gentle shimmer. The wind grew colder, brushing against tired skin. Some women wrapped their blankets tighter around their narrow shoulders. Others stood still, allowing the cold to bite them awake from the surreal stillness of the moment. When the final woman was identified, the sergeant stepped forward once more. He scanned the group. Hundreds of women standing together, some trembling, some steady, all transformed by the events of the day. His voice carried across the clearing, firm enough to command attention, but softened by the weight of everything that had transpired. It was time to board the trucks. The women moved in small clusters, directed by soldiers who guided them toward the wooden steps at the back of each vehicle. Some struggled to climb. The soldiers helped without hesitation. A few women offered whispered thanks, words that felt awkward, foreign yet sincere. Others avoided eye contact, still unsure whether gratitude had a place in captivity. Inside the trucks, the women settled onto rough wooden benches. They huddled together for warmth, their breath filling the enclosed space with a faint mist. The soldiers closed the back gates gently, not slamming them, not locking them with violent force, but securing them with measured precision. As the engine started, a low hum vibrated through the truck beds. The women held onto the wooden sides, bracing themselves for the movement. Outside, the sergeant watched each vehicle in turn, his posture unchanging, his expression unreadable. The trucks rolled forward, leaving behind the clearing where fear had broken, shifted, and reshaped itself. The camp faded behind them. The trees thinned. The dirt road stretched ahead into uncertainty, but a different kind of uncertainty than before. Not the unpredictability of violence, not the terror of the unknown enemy, but the uncertainty of survival, of facing life after war, of confronting the weight of everything they had endured. As the convoy moved into the distance, the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky into a wide expanse of fading gold and deepening blue. The women sat quietly in the truck beds, clutching their few possessions, their ration tins, their blankets. Some stared at the horizon. Others closed their eyes, letting exhaustion pull them under. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, they allowed themselves to imagine tomorrow.